So Maxxxine was directed by Ty West, and it stars Mia Goth once again returning as Maxxxine herself, as well as featuring a bunch of new people in this movie, including Elizabeth Debicki, Kevin Bacon, Michelle Monaghan, Giancarlo Esposito, Bobby Cannavale. A whole slew of people are in this movie. And taking place sometime after the events of X, Maxxxine, who is the only survivor of the massacre in that movie, she's trying to break out in Hollywood. She's trying to move past being in the adult entertainment business and such. However, there is a killer who is out there in Hollywood known as the Night Stalker, who is killing people who are strangely and ironically attached to Maxxine in some way. So this was a movie that I was really looking forward to. I did enjoy the first two movies in this trilogy of movies. X was a pretty fun throwback to like all those 70s like grindhouse type movies and such. Pearl I thought was a very different movie, but I thought it was a much better film overall. I thought Mia Goth was really good in that movie. Definitely better than X in my opinion. And I was definitely curious to see like what this movie was going to be like. How is it going to tie back into the whole franchise and such. And I was definitely curious to see what this movie was going to be like. And honestly, I liked it for the most part, but I'm also a little disappointed. This movie is not great by any means. It's not awful. I do like most of it, but there are some moments where I'm like, maybe that could have been done a little bit better. But let's start off with the acting in this movie, which I thought was pretty solid for the most part. Mia Goth is really good in this movie. I wouldn't say she's as good as she was in Pearl, but I'd say she's definitely better than she was in X. I thought she was good. Kevin Bacon is pretty fun in this movie. He's an intimidating figure in this movie. Giancarlo Esposito is kind of having fun. Usually he's like this very stern, very like evil character in movies and such. But he's really good in this movie, kind of having a lot more fun than he normally has in movies. Among the other actors, Elizabeth Debicki does a decent job as a mentor director to Maxxine in this movie. And other actors do fine with some of the work they do, which isn't really a whole lot, but I'll talk about that. Like Halsey, Lily Collins has a fun moment about halfway through the movie. Michelle Monaghan and Bobby Cannavale are good, but again, they don't really get too much to do in this movie, but I'll talk about that. Meanwhile, it looks incredible. It looks like it was literally from the 80s. Like the cinematography looks incredible. Like it kind of evokes a lot of those movies from the 80s where it's like, you know, a little sleazy, a little neonish, and I do think that's very fascinating. The soundtrack also really well done. It's a really good soundtrack overall. It's definitely unpredictable. Like, admittedly, I didn't see the twist coming in the third act, but then again, I also just rewatched X and Pearl like right before this, like literally the day of. So I kind of didn't see it coming. It's like, oh, okay, well that's kind of interesting how it kind of ties back into like all this stuff from the first movie and such. That was kind of interesting. And also, I do think that kind of like X and Pearl, it does pay homage to not just like slasher movies in general, but just kind of like the 80s in general. I do think Ty West does a really good job of that for the most part. But that's also kind of my main issue, is that I feel like it's not as strong as some of those other two movies. Like, even though the 80s aesthetic is there, it's not as apparent as something like X or Pearl, and it's not as strong as those two movies were. Which is kind of my biggest gripe about this movie, is that every complaint I have is like, oh, this is not as strong as the last two movies in the franchise. Mia Goth is good in this movie, but she's not as strong as she was in Pearl. It's not admittedly as fun as X was, and it's not as creepy as Pearl was. And also, I feel like the kills in themselves aren't really that impressive. They're kind of like very generic-ish. Like there's one for Moses Sumney in this movie, who I would say he's one of the weaker points of this movie. His death scene is just kind of generic, honestly. And there's even one you don't even see halfway through the movie, which is kind of like, actually it's towards the end of the movie. But one character does get killed off, and it's like, that could be an interesting death. I kind of wish we would have seen that, and considering how far this franchise has gone in terms of, like, you know, what they show and such, you would think they would show a death scene. And surprisingly, they don't, and I feel like that would have been an interesting death, but it's like, they don't want that. I'm like, interesting. But, and also, a lot of the actors in this movie don't really get a whole lot to do. But then again, they try the best that they can. Like Giancarlo Esposito is a very small supporting role, but he does the best that he can. Lily Collins has a very brief role in this movie, but she's a scene stealer for her one moment. But everyone else in this movie, I feel like there's really not too much there for anybody. Like, I look back at X and Pearl and look back into some of the supporting cast, and I'm like, you know, some of the supporting cast actually stood out a bit. In X, you know, Jenna Ortega stood out, Brittany Snow stood out, Kid Cudi stood out a little bit, Martin Henderson. But, and also in Pearl, you know, the actress who played Pearl's mother stood out quite a bit. David Cornsweet, who's going to be the new Superman, he stood out a bit. But in this movie, I feel like most of the people just are given too little to do. Again, they do the best that they can, But again, a lot of my complaints about this movie are just the fact that it's just not as strong as some of the other entries in this franchise. So, and also, admittedly, even though I didn't see the twist coming, I still thought the third act was a bit weak and kind of just there. Unfortunately, it just didn't quite work out for me, honestly. It just, again, a lot of the stuff is not as strong as it was in the first or second movie. And I feel like if you really love the first two movies, you'll more than likely really love this movie. If you're like me, you can still appreciate a lot of it and still say, yeah, this is still fun, this is still a good time, and a lot of performances are solid. But you'll still note that a lot of the stuff in it is just not as strong as some of the other movies in this franchise. So even though the acting's really good, the 80s aesthetic is there, but again, I just think the 80s is just overdone at this point. Let's just move on from the 80s at this point. I don't think we never really gave up on the 80s, but whatever. The soundtrack is good. It's pretty unpredictable. The homages are there. I just feel like some of the death scenes are just kind of generic or non-existent even. It's not as fun. The kills are impressive. It's just not as strong as the other two movies. And it's okay. Like, you could watch it and say, oh, this is solid. This is solid enough. Like, it's... But you look back at those other two movies and are like, look at what this franchise has done. And you kind of look at Maxxxine and go, well, that's a bit underwhelming. I'll give Maxxxine 2.5 out of 4 stars. Stream it. So, what's your favorite horror movie franchise? Comment down below. Subscribe to the channel. This is Pat. Stay safe.